Hello fairy friends, I am back with the Carlos Gotz doll. You'll recall from the previous video I had used the 10% benzoyl peroxide to remove the dye stains on the face from the original wig. So she does have a wig waiting, but first we're going to see what we can do as far as giving her some color back to her face and some realism. I will be going over the techniques that I use and the products, but as far as doing the actual repaint, I'll be doing a time lapse so it doesn't take up too much time. Alright, so what I'm going to do is start by adding a little bit of dimension and color. And what I think I'll try is this color, and I can't tell you what they are. I wish that I could, but I can't. I get a little bit damp. And then play around. Sometimes a damp Q-tip will help push around the color. Sometimes not. There we go. And that is just, I'm not adding any details that aren't already there in the sculpting. So, in general, one of the features of an Asian person is a hooded eyelid, which, I mean, it's not always the case. Not all Asians have hooded eyes, but in general they do. And it's not just Asians that have them. I actually have hooded eyes, which means I have some of a crease, but not much. Okay. So I'm not trying to make a crease. This is marked and it says light peach. So I'm not trying to make a crease for the doll. I'm following some of the sculpting detail. And a lot of times what reborn artists are doing is they are just looking at what the sculptor originally sculpted. So sometimes you can use paints to change the sculpt, but then sometimes you can use paints to bring out what the sculptor already had sculpted. Does that make sense? So what I'm doing here is there is already a little bit of an indentation here above the eye. It is not a crease, so I'm not going to do a harsh line. In makeup, they'll call that like a cut crease, and you can, fake a crease if you don't have one. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm just going by the line that's already there. And a lot of this stuff is subtle, and you won't be able to see it until you go back to look at your before and after. And I wish I knew what this watercolor pencil color was, but it's just not written. It's like a burnt sienna. It's a brown with a little hint of red in it. And what I'm doing, even though the nose doesn't really need much definition, it's pretty pronounced in the sculpting, I'm noticing with this particular vinyl that the creases look gray in color, and I'm not really liking that. So I'm using the brown, not to add definition, but to warm up that gray. So that's what I'm doing here around the nose. Okay, and what I'm going to do is start on the lips, and I'm going to just put a thin coat of the same brown that we've been using here. And that's just to start it out. I don't want it to be a brown lip. That's just going to be inside the mouth to darken it up and to lay just a little bit of color, because a lot of these things, like I had said, are subtle. You won't be able to see the difference until before and after pictures. And sometimes you don't actually know what all went into it, but a lot of small steps usually go into this. So I'm going to put this color down first on the lips, and I like to put most of the color in the center of the lips and then move out, and then make sure my brush strokes for the most part are going in the direction of the creases that appear on our lips normally. And that way we're kind of using the brush strokes to our advantage to add that texture that we're looking for. And it's definitely going to be a lot better, no matter how it turns out. It's going to be better than the glossy plum lipstick that it seemed to have when these first came out. It was kind of like the Baby So Beautiful dolls. They kind of went overboard with the lip color, and you definitely wouldn't call it realistic, but in the 90s that was kind of a thing with the dolls. So okay, let us move on to terracotta. Get that wet. Okay, now let's use crimson red. There we go. And this, I want those dark red, ruddy cheeks that we see in my reference photos. And it might be time to reload up on the color here. And then if it looks like it's got a little bit too pigmented, then get it wet, wipe it off before it gets in there. Now I'm going to go ahead with the crimson. I do have the terracotta on there. Sometimes you, the colors you add can blend. Sometimes one will overpower the other. Sometimes you put one on and it doesn't make much of a difference. So we'll see, because it looks as though the terracotta isn't going to add much to it. But there again, you don't know. These are all little subtle changes that you make. And it's what makes one repaint different from another. Did look back at my reference photo, and I do want to add a little bit more brown inside the eyes. So loading up again, away from my doll, so I don't flick the watery paint on. Okay, so I loaded it up, and I want to, there's a little bit of water that's gonna leak down. I want to get into that lash line. And add a little bit more shading. And I'm not really worried about getting it on the eye, because the eye is a glossy acrylic. It's not gonna accept this color at all. And I can go through and clean it up with a Q-tip. Just like you would some dust maybe. There. So I just want to make it so that those lashes that I am keeping there, because I feel like that made it distinctive to this doll, and I don't think it takes away from the realism necessarily. Again, this isn't a super realistic doll, but I think if I do a little bit more shading there, that those lashes won't look so jarring, if that makes sense. And I feel like that's going to open up the eyes a little bit more to make them a little bit more expressive. And so that the baby doesn't look like she's just falling asleep. Put a little bit more here. Aw, it is turning out pretty cute, I think. And then I'll have to decide on the eyebrows, but I think I'm going to do the eyebrows in the reference photo. Let's add a little bit more color on here. After I finish adding this layer of color on the lips, I will be moving on to the eyebrows, which are the most difficult for me usually because I need to make them to look realistic and I need them to be even, and so I always put those off till last. So I'm going to save that for part 2 because this video is kind of a little bit longer than what I thought. In part 2, I'll also be putting her back on her body and doing some blushing and some color on her limbs. So stay tuned for part 2. Thank you guys for spending some time with me, and I hope you have a magical day. Bye-bye.